Intensive care for Brenda Williams. How long shall I stay? Are there words to say? The pain makes you mute. Morphine has no song. 45 years is a long time to be together and apart. Husband and ex-husband. Now care for your cats, who met me this morning, bewildered by your absence as I changed and filled bowls and watched their bent heads lapping. Sat by your bed, the drip, the battery of instruments, measuring input and output, flow charts, cannulas and clips. The hands of the nurse move with the precision of a pianist from point to point, pressing, adjusting, constantly checking. He waves the sister away when his break is due. I'll let you know. I've things to do. I listen, but your words are few, and drop to silence before a sentence is halfway through. Your eyes close. I moisten your lips. The odds were against, but for a second time you survive. And when you woke, your question, are my cats alive? 2 calls, 22 hours waiting for a diagnosis, and you at the point of death. 3 weeks on wards, IT3, IT4, DW7, numbers burned into my brain with the memory of your pain. The creases on your brow, the steel clips, the ward rounds I always missed, your terror on discharge, your arms like sticks, your face swathed in death's pallor. You could just lift a cup. The continuous nightmares, the cats at the door, the letters on the floor. For weeks you waited for me to come and count the tablets one by one. Heat up food, continue with the cats. Slowly, how so slowly, the cuts began to heal. You moved more steadily, the weeks passing, a new month beginning. February half through, you said you could get through when my own op was due. Nothing we were told was clinically true. The unmentionable pain, the nightmares, the absolute lack of aftercare, these we knew. And so, like Lawrence, I may say, look, we have come through. This poem was published in a pamphlet at the beginning of 2012 called The Leeds Poetry Renaissance, a personal memoir, and it was really done in this way because I knew that I was going to have one operation, which turned out to be 2, and Brenda was going to have a second operation, and I would like to put these things together in case anything happened, which fortunately it didn't. And the reason I did this was because the idea of the Leeds Poetry Renaissance is an idea which has been bandied about in the critical, academic, literary world for a number of years. One academic was going to write a book on this, but in fact it ended up with being a chapter in a very obscure book. The book never got written, and quite why, I don't know. I was very fortunate in that I was in Leeds as a student in the early 60s, which is the time when the Leeds Poetry Renaissance was full blossoming. The only book which covers this to some degree is the biography of Peter Redgrove, which appeared a few months ago, but which of course concentrates on Redgrove, a man and a poet I knew very well. He was essentially, I think, a performative poet and a very effective one. I remember meeting him for the first time in Guiseley Town Hall. It was a very dark, wet winter night, and he'd just been appointed to the Gregory Fellowship. And it was a room full of steaming Macintoshes and radiators and smoke from cigarettes and pipes. And on a days at the very far end of the room I was in, there was this figure which stood up, and I'll never forget his opening sentence, delivered with great panache. A brain in a storm, a tree in a storm is like a brain in a brainstorm. And he issued this kind of declamatory writing, which was kind of personification of his written work. But over the years, I came to feel more and more that there was less and less value in his work. And he certainly was not the most talented of the Gregory Fellows. There is a slight confusion here, because the Leeds Poetry Renaissance did not entirely by any means consist of poets who were Gregory Fellows in poetry, although some of them were. To me, the most notable of the Gregory Fellows was the late, great Martin Bell. He was my mentor, a lovely man, sadly a very depressed person who tried to ameliorate his sadness with alcohol, but he was never an aggressive person. In fact, he was a very kind person, and someone who taught me an enormous amount. And he gave me a reading once. It was a very strange occurrence. There was then the Leeds Civic Hall, and the late Ted Hughes was supposed to give a reading, but of course Hughes was very unreliable and didn't turn up. And Martin Bell, who had arranged the reading, was very embarrassed. I was sat in the front row together with Geoffrey Hill, and Martin Bell took over, and I'd just had my first pamphlet, The Quarrel with Ourselves, published by Alan Tarling's Poet and Printer Press, who at the same year brought out The Establishment Songs by Christopher Logue and Ted Hughes' Scapegoats and Rabies, and Martin was kind enough to read some of my poems to an incredibly packed Civic Hall with 500 or 600 people, and people stood in the aisles waiting in vain for Ted Hughes. Martin certainly was the most talented of the Gregory Fellows, but there were other very good Gregory Fellows. Of course, Thomas Blackburn, when I was still a school child, and the first Gregory Fellow of all, James Kirkup. Kirkup has fallen into entire desuetude. He too was a mentor of mine. We corresponded when he was a professor in Japan. We never met, and I think he was at one time certainly the white hope of English poetry, along with W.S. Graham. That was in the view of a lesser-known Gregory Fellow who has now fallen into entire obscurity, Bill Price Turner. And Kirkup's early work, The Sleeper in the Earth, published by Greywall's Press by Ray Gardner in 1946, was truly an astonishing poem. His later poems, which gained him fame, such as The Descent into the Cave and A Correct Compassion, to me were too constructed. He wrote a vast amount. He spoke and translated somewhere, I think, between 11 and 12 languages, including Vietnamese. He was an incredibly strange person who permanently alienated himself by living in Andorra and was bitterly angry at the lack of response his work gained, but it was a very strange place to live in. In his extreme old age, he became very venomous, and he wrote some memoirs, at the beginning of which he spent 20 pages in a huge attack on the novelist. I can't remember his name. He was a gay novelist who had helped Kirkup, and it was completely, absolutely denigratory and could have been the subject of legal action. And he gave me a paragraph in which he created complete lies about me, suggesting I'd tried to take money from someone he knew to visit Kirkup in Japan. I'm a complete phobic person about travelling. I would never go beyond Paris, and then only on the Eurostar. I don't know why Jeremy Reed said this is a narcissism of extreme old age, but it's a very sad ending. I probably idealised him, and certainly I don't regard his work in the way I used to do. But there are other people who lived in Leeds at this time who were not Gregory Fellows. The most famous, of course, is the current Professor of Poetry at Oxford, Geoffrey Hill, whose early work I very much admired, but whose last work to me becomes inextricably, totally incomprehensible. I knew Hill slightly. I found him very cold and schizoid, even then when he was in his 30s. There was also, of course, James Symonds, to me the greatest Irish poet since Yeats, but I never knew Symonds. He was there as an undergraduate, and then he returned to Ireland, where he became incredibly well known, and he edited The Honest Ulsterman, and he was a lecturer at the new University of Ulster. And very sadly, I only got to know him in the months before his fatal stroke. Hopefully, at some point, some academic will actually write a full-length study of the Leeds Poetry Renaissance and expand my notes into a full-length book which puts these various poets into perspective. One poet, of course, that people would expect me to mention is Tony Harrison. Symonds called him Hard Man Harrison. Is not a poet whose work I respect. I never met him. When I was being published in the early 60s by Alan Tarling's Poet and Printer Press, he was being published by Leeds University's typographical department in a small series of pamphlets called Northern House Poets, which also published the early work of Geoffrey Wainwright, I think, and Preghieri, which was Geoffrey Hill's first movement into the slightly incomprehensible. There were other interesting Gregory Fellows. There was John Silkin, who I knew well, but was never more than a minor poet. David Wright, a lovely man, but again not only a minor poet. And John Heath Stubbs, who I never met in Leeds, but I met in London just before his death a few years ago. It was an incredibly interesting time to be alive, to be young, to be a student, to be a poet in Leeds. This was one of the most interesting periods of my life. My former wife, Brenda Williams, father, long deceased, met Martin Bell in the Hyde Park pub, and Brenda's father was reading my first pamphlet, and Martin Bell struck up a conversation with him. This is one of those really extraordinary meetings. The only one I can think which is akin to that is the meeting between Martin Bell and Peter Redgrove in a cafe in Chiswick. Neither knew each other, but both became, or certainly one of them became an integral member of the group. Nobody has again written a history of the group, which is a fascinating, different story to the Leeds Poetry Renaissance, and one someone else will have to tell, because my knowledge of that is extremely peripheral. Anyway, this is the pamphlet.